A very foundational aspect of a life that's filled with a lot of unnecessary suffering is avoidance, right? Really, suffering is avoidance. Suffering is the resistance to our experience, right? We're experiencing something, our mind categorizes it as undesirable, and then we resist it, we avoid it, we fight against it, and from this, suffering arises. I make a distinction between pain, right, physical pain, even emotional pain like grief or guilt or sadness, and suffering. Because when you actually release all your resistance to, let's say, emotional pain, there's actually no more suffering found in that experience. It's actually a very profound experience. It's this beautiful flow of energy, this just like complex array of flowing sensation. It's actually once you start to fight against these parts of yourself that the experience of suffering starts to emerge. Right? Same thing with physical pain, actually. If you are in physical pain and you don't resist the sensations, you actually will not suffer. Right? And very advanced people embody this one. Right? I'm not saying that I can be in a lot of physical pain and not suffer. Right? But certain people actually can, right? Certain Buddhist monks, right, who have burned themselves alive, for example, they're able to sit there in meditation, right, and they don't resist it. Peter Ralston, for example, gets a root canal done without any painkillers, right? His response to, how he's able to do that is, you have to know what pain is, right? You have to know these internal mechanics, right? So whenever you are experiencing something undesirable, right, waiting in line, for example, right, you ever wait in line before and everyone there, no one really wants to be there and now everyone's mad and everyone's suffering about it, right? Even though, what are we doing? Why are we even suffering? We're just standing here, right? It's like a minor inconvenience at best, right? It's actually because we feel so insecure in the moment. We can't sit and be present, right? We can't just sit with ourselves. We always have to be doing stuff, right? This is why, we will be so, in a sense, neurotic when we're kind of just waiting in line. Get angry. We can't just stand there. Can't just be present. We can't just not distract ourselves, right? We always have to be avoiding ourselves constantly. What if you were standing in line and you just fully embraced standing in line, right? What if every second of that experience you just had no resistance to it whatsoever? A full embrace, feeling every sensation, breathing mindfully, not just struggling against it. Full openness to that experience. Would you be suffering then? No, you actually wouldn't. Suffering is resistance and something that you don't want to be experiencing. Or avoidance, right? Avoidance, can be categorized as a form of resistance. Even if you have very positive feelings and you start resisting them, you'll get very uncomfortable, so you'll start suffering, actually. So when you find yourself in the midst of suffering, a very counterintuitive move that you could make is to actually turn your attention back towards yourself and focus on the sensations in the body. Focus back towards yourself rather than escaping yourself habitually. You'll find that a lot of your suffering is caused by this continuous tendency to avoid and escape yourself. Right? To get away from where you are now. And this is why I emphasize meditation so much in a lot of my videos and meditation retreats, because this is really impossible without meditation. Because meditation is essentially just sitting down and observing the present. It's just observation of experience. Observing how you create suffering, for example. Observing emotion and feeling emotion. there's no suffering found in any emotion. There's only suffering found in how you relate to an emotion. 90 to 95% of suffering, if not more, is actually completely self-inflicted. This is a complete shift in paradigm from how we typically perceive of suffering. We think that when we're suffering, it's like, this has to be this way, and then I'll be okay. Right? It's like we're rearranging the external world to solve an internal problem. And at one point, even if we succeed in doing that, right, it only solves that problem for a little bit, and then the external world changes because we can't really control it. It's very unpredictable, right? And then we're back again to like reacting and suffering, and right? So it's like we're trying to rearrange the external habitually to solve the internal problem. What happens if we just go right to the internal problem? Just giving it attention, having compassion for our own suffering, right? Feeling into the nuance of our experience, noticing our resistance and our avoidance, and just saying, you know what, for the hell of it, just as an experiment, I'll let go. I won't resist this wave of sadness, this wave of grief. And I'll see what happens. I'll fully embrace it. Right? Instead of viewing it as something undesirable and negative, right? Just allowing yourself to fully experience it. And just seeing what happens. Right? I'm sure many of you guys have had experiences of sadness, but they're not negative experiences, right? It's like a positive sadness because you're not resisting it. So the thing that makes this really hard isn't just avoidance, right? And it's not just that we're not paying attention to ourselves and we're not meditating and we're always disconnecting from ourselves. It's not just that, right? Of course, all that makes it very, very difficult. But a very core aspect is that in the world that we currently exist in, there's just endless outlets, right, to just escape ourselves. Because our culture is quite literally built on just avoidance and escape. Right? This is something that happens in our politics. The most obvious one is entertainment. Right? This happens in every major thing in our culture. Just a pure avoidance of the present and ourselves. So because our culture is like structured in this way where it's just, built on avoidance, it's so easy to avoid now. We have endless phones and entertainments and distractions and Netflix and junk food and triple chocolate ice cream, right? And then we use all these things as coping mechanisms for feelings of boredom, shame, guilt, grief, sadness, a sense of disconnection, a sense of disassociation, right? Endless shopping so that we can finally feel something. We can feel some excitement, something at all, right? So we just kind of use all these things as coping mechanisms. A lot of unhealthy habits, what we call bad habits, negative habits, are actually just coping mechanisms for conditioning inside of us, right? And that conditioning is usually just repressed aspects of ourselves. Repressed emotion, repressed energy that then gets stored and stuck in the body. And the second you actually process that conditioning and it dismantles, you actually will break the pattern, the sort of unhealthy habits, the pattern of being stuck in unhealthy habits. Right, so a core part that makes this so unhealthy, if I can kind of just sum it up, is that we're always using our environment to cope with pain. We're using things in our environment to distract. We can structure our environment so that it fosters self-connection, but we've unconsciously structured our environment so that it fosters self-disconnection. Right? The TV's always got to be on. The phone always has to be in our pocket. There's always got to be something to do. There's always got to be work to do. If you're not working, you're lazy. So I'm really urging you to kind of just investigate your own suffering, right? Really investigate why you avoid any of this stuff in the first place, because really a lot of this stuff is just conditioning that built itself up in childhood, and once you're a grown adult, you have the psychological ability to reflect and really go into yourself and deconstruct the ego and all the pain that the ego was built upon in the first place. Right? This is self-transcendence. This is moving into enlightenment, awakening, being. Right? The very sense of self that you experience yourself to be as separate from everything else is literally built upon the avoidance of fear and pain and the sense of just impermanence and change, the fear of that impermanence and the fear of that change, the fear of lacking stability and a definite sense of self. Right? The very foundations of our psyche in the modern world are completely founded upon avoidance and fear. Right? So just have an honest look, right? It really just kind of takes a sincere heart, a very honest look into yourself, right? And a commitment to it over time to really begin to alleviate yourself of a lot of your unnecessary suffering, right? I talk about this quite a lot in a lot of my content. So, without having an intentional time to actually meditate in your life, it becomes impossible really to become aware of yourself. You're not shining your awareness onto yourself. You're disconnected from your body. Watch one of my previous videos. The body is not an object. See, I have this really massive problem with a lot of conventional therapy, right? And a lot of conventional therapy is, people wanting to alleviate suffering, right? This is like one of the goals of therapy is we're going to alleviate human suffering, right? But most therapy doesn't ever understand the ego, the construction and the entire development of the ego. And the ego is the resisting, avoiding, denying, repressing mechanism that causes 99% of human suffering. So without addressing that root, it's bound to fail. Any kind of way of healing that doesn't address the ego is bound to fail. Not that there's no value in it, right? And there's many forms of therapy that do address the ego. There's many forms of healing that do. But without having this more integrated sort of model to go off of, the way of healing is going to fail. Without integrating cleaning up the shadow, without integrating long-term psychological development, without integrating awakening, spiritual awakening, enlightenment, without integrating what Ken Wilber calls waking up, growing up, and cleaning up, the approach is bound to fail because it's missing too much. It's missing too much of what's needed to really be well. So that's just a criticism that I have of a lot of conventional therapy, right? And I've studied a lot of psychotherapy, love psychotherapy. Personally, I like forms of psychotherapy that are more integrated with spirituality, with highly evolved, in a sense, spiritual beings who really understand the mechanics of ego and are at self-transcendent levels of psychological development. Right. See, we have to integrate all these aspects of life so that we're not so fragmented and cut off and confused. And when we are habitually cut off from our own psychological development, our own shadow, awakening, when this is like a complete ignorance, right, of course we're going to find ourselves in a lot of suffering because we're actually so disconnected and confused about life, and a lot of our suffering is trying to urge us to wake up. So that's it for this video. If you are interested in working with me, you can apply to do that. Link is in the pinned comment and the description. I don't take just anyone. I have a very limited availability, and I'm not really able to work with just anyone. Right, but if you resonate with my content, there's a chance that we could be a good match. You can apply to do that. Link is down below. Take it easy.